Here we go. So, British approach to the colonies. So in many cases, especially at the beginning, it was a hands-off policy where the British government really wanted the colonies to govern themselves, to take care of themselves, allow them to be able to rule themselves, and they'd only step in if there were any problems. And of course, that's going to be a big deal. To some extent, the New England colonies were a federal system because the colonies governed themselves and they end up forming their own individual groups, but answered to the government back home. And we have King George, who is King George III, the one who really starts to cause some of the problems. And we look at the relationship between England and the United States, well, the American colonies. There was a lot of understanding of just kind of the way things were and the way things had always been and the way things were going to continue. There was a lot of separation between the two as far as goals and ideals and distance back and forth. And there were some of these laws that had been in the books for years that had been ignored or had not been strictly followed. And up until a certain point, the Parliament just kind of swept that under the rug and let the colonies do their own thing, especially when it came to trade. Well, then King George III, he steps in, he says, wait a second, there's some things going on here that shouldn't be. We're missing out on some tax money that we should be getting from the colonies, and so we need to start enforcing some of these policies and start doing some additional things. Traditionally, colonists had the power of the purse. What does that mean? What is power of the purse? If I'm holding this, what's inside? At least I hope so. I hope there's money in there. Not much. So if I'm hanging on to this, who has the power to spend it? Me, okay? So whoever hangs on to the purse, whoever has the power of the purse, they have the power to spend the money. So colonists, they had the power of the purse. They could spend the money, the tax money that they had, the way that they desired. London was responsible here for defense and foreign trade. So the colonies were given the freedom to be able to trade within themselves, but the colonists were not supposed to trade with France. They were not supposed to trade with Spain or anybody else without consent from Parliament. And in exchange for that, then London was also going to provide defense of the colonies, make sure that they were protected. A lot of the regulation was often ignored, and that's where I said King George, when he comes to power here in 1760, he changes everything. He changes the approach. He begins to enforce a lot of the rules that should have been in place. And colonists start to voice their disagreement and their anger about these new policies that are put in place. They start writing letters to George. They start having meetings together, and that's more U.S. history than we have time to go into right now. That brings about an unintended consequence here of colonial unity. Because King George, while he was perhaps had some good intentions, trying to bring England into a greater power, he was actually driving a wedge between the colonies and the mainland, and it became an us versus them mentality. In 1643, the New England Confederation was formed, and this is the first cooperation between the colonists all together as a unit. Now, it wasn't necessarily an official league or anything like that, but it was kind of like the Delian League, if you remember that from Greek history, where it was a defensive alliance just to make sure that if anything ever happens, we're going to protect ourselves first and foremost. Then we have the Albany Plan in 1754. Anybody remember the purpose of this plan or the Albany Conference that was scheduled here by Benjamin Franklin? Why they chose to meet here? This is one that often fades from memory. The purpose of this was to discuss the growing problem between the French threat as well as the Indian problem. So this is prior to the French and Indian War, just prior, and the fact that the French are infringing on the western border of the colonies. And so Benjamin Franklin wanted all the colonies to get together to be able to talk through this issue, how we're going to approach that. Well, King George looked at that as a violation because of the fact that whose job was it to protect the colonies? Yeah, it was King George's job. And he thought he was doing a good enough job, and the colonists didn't think so. Ben Franklin was the main sponsor of that one. Stamp Act Congress in 1765. This is direct response to Parliament's requiring of a stamp to be placed on certain legal documents that they had not previously required. It was an additional way to tax the colonists. And it was one of those methods in which the British Parliament wanted to gain extra revenue to help pay for the army that had rescued these American colonists in the French and Indian War. Notice we are after French and Indian War is over. Now there's this huge debt that somebody has to pay for. And back in London, Parliament says, it wasn't our war. We shouldn't have to pay for it. And the colonists say, well, yeah, you said part of your job is to protect us, and the French were going to attack us, so you need to pay for it. And it became this massive argument over money and who's going to pay for the war. So Stamp Act Congress was a direct reaction to that, and during the Stamp Act Congress, they wrote a list of declaration of rights and grievances in which they sent to the king. And those declaration of rights and grievances, these men reminded the king of the fact that they were British citizens, and all those documents, going back to the Magna Carta, going back to the Declaration of Rights, the Bill of Rights, those all applied. And the king is not living up to those. And essentially the king just took that, tossed it in the junk mail pile. That led to Sam Adams creating the Committees of Correspondence. And I'm sure you read about him and talked about him in U.S. history, so we won't spend a lot of time there. But key idea here, their job was to coordinate activities or coordinate the response to what's going on in Great Britain. They were going to inform people, tell them, here's what's happening, here's how we need to respond, basically organizing the American people. Boston Tea Party. We all know this story, right? Where did the Boston Tea Party happen? Boston, yes. And there were a couple other places that this happened as well. No, not Chicago. I believe Savannah was another, Charleston was another target, in smaller batches, where there were also other cargo ships that were targeted as well. But why did they throw the tea overboard? No. Dutch East India Company, yeah. And why did they have all this tea sitting outside the harbor and they were forcing the Americans to pull that in? Because of the Tea Act, okay. So who was going to collect the tax money on that? England was going to collect the tax money on that. Why did they do that, by the way? Do you guys know why, the story behind that? Why they picked the tea, Dutch East India Company to do that? Yeah.
Why they pick that specific company, or why they pick tea?
Either one.
Well, tea was like coffee to us now.
Okay. Yeah. So it's very common. They knew that the people would want it, but there's another reason too.
Wasn't it their tea was a lot cheaper, and so they were trying to force the colonial tea market out of business so that they would have to really be forced to buy the British tea.
Okay, so that's part of it, yes. Why is the Dutch East India Company so important to Great Britain? Because what? Yeah, it's access to India, right? And they're bringing trade from India back to Great Britain. Well, there was a major financial crisis in which the Dutch East India Company was this close to going bankrupt. And so they went to British Parliament and they said, listen, if we don't get some assistance here really quickly, then we're going to have to go out of business. And that means you're going to lose access to India, at least through our company. You're going to have to find another source. That's one of the motivations that Parliament then put this tea on board the ship. They said, hey, ship it over to the colonists. I'm sure that they would want some. The tax on tea applied on there, but it would have applied on almost any good. So a lot of times, it's kind of got two motivations behind it. The first motivation was to kind of get money from the colonists, but the second motivation was try to rescue a company that was in dire need at that time that was essential to the economy of Great Britain. So to me, I think it's important that we also jump into the British side of things and look at from a Parliament's perspective. At the same time, we often take that ethnocentric view of American side, and we're just angry at Parliament, and they were terrible, and they were awful, and they didn't understand us. That's not necessarily always the case. So, jumping ahead here, First Continental Congress is called together in 1774. It's a response to the intolerable acts that are passed by Parliament, and those were a retribution, a direct response to the Boston Tea Party. And so they put these acts together that were, in many cases, unfair, intolerable. You know what the British called these acts when they wrote them? Coercion. Yeah, they were coercion. The colonists labeled them intolerable, and since the winners of history, or the winners in the battle, generally write the history, that's why most history books say intolerable acts, not coercive acts. But it was a way to coerce the colonists into obedience and into submission. And we all know how that worked. So, results here of the First Continental Congress, there is a new foundation of relationships that are formed among the colonies. They begin to see how they can work together. They also create a formal Declaration of Rights that begin to establish what they believe their role in the world looks like and what they believe every citizen is entitled to. And they send a copy of that back to King George for his reading, which I don't know if he actually did. And they committed to boycott all British goods until the tax was repealed. You ever try to boycott on anything? I mean, I remember when I was in high school, there was this push by a bunch of Christian organizations to boycott Hollywood. And anything that was associated with Hollywood, and that included many of its branch-out companies that were associated with it. And as we started hearing about it, there were more and more companies that came down to the fact, like, you couldn't shop hardly anywhere. You couldn't watch TV at all. You couldn't hardly even get gas in your car, and many of your cars were manufactured or had some sort of connection with Hollywood. And it was just like crazy, the lines with all of that stuff. So I would caution you against boycotting something so broad. Now, there are certain things that certainly would be a valuable thing to boycott. I remember, was it 2 years ago when the whole Target boycott was going around? So some people are still boycotting Target over that issue. So Target was one of the first companies that openly invited, they said, our restrooms we're still going to keep the gender labels on them, but if somebody identifies as a female, we're not going to stop them from using the ladies' restroom, and vice versa. If somebody identifies as a man, they can go use the men's restroom. So that was huge, largely controversial. So somebody, like one of you guys, could say, I feel like a girl today, and you can just walk in the girls' restroom, and they were not going to report you or do anything. So that's why we started using the family restroom at places when we take our kids there. All right, so I mentioned boycott. Second Continental Congress. Second Continental Congress happens after the first shots break out in Concord and Lexington. So it's a response to the fighting that has begun. All of the colonies are present here at this meeting, and they see the importance and significance of where we are at and the fact that it seems as though reconciliation with the king is not going to happen. And there are some people in the colonies that were really hesitant to come to this meeting. They believe themselves to still be loyal to Great Britain and they loyal to the king. They did not want to separate, but we get to this point here after the shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, and everybody sends delegates and everybody sends representation to the Second Continental Congress. So everybody's there at that one. We have George Washington comes to the scene in a leadership role for the first time, and it's at this meeting here that they appoint him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And he accepts that role. They establish a unicameral legislature. Here's a vocab term that's government-related. I don't know if you got this in U.S. history or not. Unicameral means one, so there's one house that's represented here. So each colony gets to send delegates, and there's one house. They decide how the rules are going to move forward and what procedures they're going to take. This is an act of treason, plain and simple. When they met at the Second Continental Congress and they put George Washington in control of an army that was not under British control, they had just committed treason. And so many of you have seen National Treasure, and there's that famous line where he talks about all these guys that would have been hanged, drugged through the streets and stuff because of this act. And it's really true. And if you think about what history would look like had the war gone the other way, all these people that we've made statues and named cities after and people on our money would have been totally defamed in history. And we'd be having a much different conversation today. So, Declaration of Independence, of course, is one of our most famous documents. There is not a map on the back. I have not personally inspected it, however. I have not. I have not. Yeah. Yeah. So, have you seen the movie National Treasure? Okay. Okay, sometime when you have nothing else to do and you just want to enjoy a good movie that has some relevance to history but is not totally accurate, go watch National Treasure. It's good entertainment. Kind of cheesy, but yeah. Okay. These five guys were the committee that were set to sit down and write the ideas that were discussed in this Continental Congress into the Declaration of Independence. So this is the committee of five. We have Franklin, Livingston, Adams, Sherman, and Jefferson. Most of the actual penmanship was done by Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was a huge fan of John Locke, and so that's why you see some of John Locke's philosophy and ideas incorporated into the wording of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, July 4th, 1776 is the day that we celebrate as Independence Day. Although the Congress actually approved on July 2nd, but it wasn't until July 4th that they made it public and they announced it to the world. So that would be awesome. Yes, it would be awesome. Most of the Declaration of Independence relies on the social contract theory. Because you guys aced this in Chapter 1, you guys know what the social contract theory is. It also consists of a list of grievances, and it is essentially a document that tells the world our rationale, our justification for going to war against our own nation. Some of you are really good at this when it comes to making arguments with authorities, and not in a bad way, but you have a list of, here's why I think I'm right, and you go to that person and try to persuade them. That's what the Declaration of Independence was doing. John Hancock, after signing it, of course, he has the largest signature on the Declaration itself. He says there, His Majesty can now read my name without glasses, and he can double the reward on my head. And for those of you that are going to D.C., we're going to go by and we're going to see the original Declaration of Independence, and his is one of the few names that you can still read. Sadly, over time and just the ink has faded, you can still read his very clearly. Ben Franklin said, we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. And that was really true. Yeah. So each state now had the opportunity to write their own constitution. And as they do, many of them replace the British Charter, because once they declare themselves independent, now they really don't have a government. And so they all draft their own constitutions that apply to their states. And several of the states include these 5 features. They include things like popular sovereignty. And what does that term mean? What's popular sovereignty? Okay, there's control within the borders, but who keeps the control? The majority rules. The people are the ones that maintain the power. All right, they're sovereign over their own borders, sovereign over their own affairs and their own ideas. We already talked about limited government, civil rights, although civil rights meant something very different than what it means today. We're not going to go into that particular issue right now. Separation of powers and checks and balances, making sure that no element of their state government got out of hand. And then terms of office. Correct me if I'm wrong, if any of you find this to be untrue, but I believe that every one of these original 13 state constitutions did have a limitation on how long a person could serve in their government. And that was because of the fact that they had dealt with a king who essentially served for life, and they saw the dangers that came along with that. Suffrage was also part of that. What is the government usage of suffrage? What does that mean? Voting. Good. Okay, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. That's not actually real suffering. And legislative supremacy. That means that we have the elected body of legislators or lawmakers are the ones that have the most importance in these state governments.